Hey everybody, it's EJ from eyedesyn.com, and today I have a workflow related tutorial for you all about the Correction Deformer and how it can improve your workflow in Cinema 4D. So the Correction Deformer is kind of like the Swiss Army knife of Cinema 4D, where it is a very simple object, but it is so versatile and powerful, a lot of use cases, and I'm going to be covering a lot of those use cases in this video today. So let's go on and improve your workflow, get enhanced, and learn all about the Correction Deformer. Let's do it. Alright, so let's learn about the very useful Correction Deformer, which you can find in the Vast Deformer menu here. And the Correction Deformer looks like a pickle with like motion tracker balls on it. But basically what the Correction Deformer allows you to do is if you make it a child of an object, you can see that we actually now have access to the polygons, edges, and points of an object. And we can actually, manipulate the object as well. So we can manipulate and move all these polygons and points and edges to our heart's content here. So this is like base level of what it allows you to do. Now, hopefully you understand how kind of crucial this is, because typically the only way you can have access to points, polygons, or edges is by making a parametric object editable. But with the Correction Deformer, you can still maintain all the parametric options. Like in our sphere object here, we can still adjust the radius. If I go into my garage shading lines mode, we can up the segments, and all those edits that we made will basically just be subdivided, which is really awesome. We can also, adjust the type of sphere we have going on here. So this is super, super useful. So base level, it allows you to manipulate points and edges and polygons. We can adjust the strength of all those edits that we made with the Correction Deformer. And we also have a fall off to, actually control how the Correction Deformer is passed along here. So we can, adjust the position offset here. So if we go and offset and at the Z here, you can see that that's actually just kind of controlling our deformation there. Whoop, like that. But we'll just leave this at infinite. So base level, that's what it allows you to do. Now, what we can do with the Correction Deformer on top of this, or utilizing this newfound access we have to all of our parametric objects, is all up to your imagination and just kind of playing around. And some of the most useful applications of using the Correction Deformer is something as simple as let's just grab a new Correction Deformer here. And again, we have access to polygons. So what I can do is do like a loop selection by hitting U and then L. And we'll just do a couple loop selections here. And now what we can do is go to our select menu and say set selection. And we'll then, apply like this yellow material to our sphere, and then use that polygon selection that we just made. But actually that didn't work. You're not seeing any yellow material on our sphere. Well, the thing we need to do is actually move this polygon selection tag onto the object we want to affect. And now we have our nice yellow material here. And I'm using a Pro Render here in the new version of R19. And you can see that's kind of doing its thing here. But I'll just get out of that. But you can basically see that, all right, we have, if I turn off the lines and all that stuff, we have our polygon selection with the Correction Deformer. So again, typically the only way you could do that and make polygon selections to an object and apply new materials to it is by making that parametric object editable. Not with the Correction Deformer. The Correction Deformer kind of allows you to work parametrically and still have that live sphere object. So same thing with a generator object like our sweep object here. The big thing with the sweep object is we need to make sure and this goes with extrudes as well, we make sure that this create single object is on, because what that basically does is it merges or melds the caps with the other parts of the geometry here. If we had this turned off, the caps would be its own object. So very important, create single object. And now what we could do is, so one way to have a deformer act upon an object is making it the child of that object, or we can group this object, and for generators, there we go, that's the word, we can have the deformer as the same level of hierarchy underneath a parent object, and it'll act upon it as well. So I'll just grab another correction deformer, drag it in the same level of hierarchy here, and I'll actually, you can see that we have a little spin wheel here just because the correction deformer needs to calculate all the points and all that stuff. We're gonna have the sweep object first, the correction deformer second, just so our order of our operations is correct. And now what we can do is we can go into our polygon mode, and we have access to all the polygons, edges, and points of the geometry created with our sweep object, which is really, really huge, because we'd also have to make this whole sweep object editable, which would totally keep us from being able to edit things like the radius of the circle and, you know, the scale of our sweep deformer and all this stuff. We can keep all that live and active, and say if we want to make a loop selection on our little 2B object here to maybe apply a yellow material to that, we can go and say set selection. And again, we're going to need to move this to the actual object that we want to apply the material to, and then maybe get this teal object or this teal material. Just go and drag and drop that polygon selection, and you'll see, boom, we now have our material, our green material, applied to that selection that we had access to via our correction deformer. So really, really huge stuff that you can do that really helps improve my workflow, because I hate making things editable, because typically what you'd have to do is, you know, make a copy of that object, make it editable, and then have access to all this stuff. And if you're like, maybe I actually wanted this a little bit thicker over here, what you need to do is delete that, go back to your sweep object, and do it all over again. So this just opens up the possibilities of so many things, allows you to keep working and not worry about making things editable and losing the ability to change and edit all these options in your generator objects, or even your, you know, parametric spline objects. So really huge stuff. So other stuff you can do with the access to edges and points and all that stuff is you know, making some loop selections here, some edge loop selections, and say we want to use the edge to spline. We can do that, and you'll see that this has actually created a spline that's underneath the correction deformer, and say we can now, you know, do whatever we want with this spline. So maybe we want to let's there's our circle. So we got our circle spline. Maybe we want to, you know, be all crazy and sweep that circle along that new spline that we just made. So we'll drag another sweep object here, and we'll have this as the profile spline, and we'll have that sweep along the correction spline that we have here. And now we have this new piece of geometry, new sweep object here, and we can do whatever the heck we want. We can get all crazy. And again, you know, that was accessed with the correction deformer. So cool stuff there. One other thing with the correction deformer, and you know, if I restore this polygon selection here, is we can go ahead and use this polygon selection to say limit what polygons we want to, say, bevel. So we can use this to isolate certain bits of our geometry to apply other deformers to. So if I apply this bevel deformer, and one thing I want to say right now is that you know, how you apply deformers is very dependent on the order of operations. Just like effects in After Effects, if you have a drop shadow and then a fill, where that fill is going to fill in that drop shadow before it. And typically you don't want to do that. So you'd have your fill effect and then your drop shadow, right? So same thing in Cinema 4D, where we actually want to have access to all of our edges and polygons and points, and then have the bevel deformer have access to all that stuff as well. So you're going to see that that actually beveled our selection here a little bit. So our polygon selection green here just kind of got beveled in. But what we can do is say, you know what, we're going to use polygons and use this polygon selection we just made and just, bevel, or in this case, it's kind of extruding those polygon selections right here. So this is really, really awesome. So we can add some subdivisions here, and you're going to notice that when we start introducing subdivisions here, especially if I go ahead and maybe adjust polygon points or subdivisions on some of these objects here. So let's just go ahead and adjust this to like 30. Once you change anything in your subdivision or in your parametric object or your let's just change this as well. So change the angle to 2. So basically we're messing up the spline and how many points there are. And you're going to see that everything just changed. Our polygon selection got messed up. And this is because we changed how many polygons there were in our object here. So it's going to change everything, including the material selection. So what we need to do, since we added more points or took away points or polygons, we'll need to redo all this, right? So I'm not going to do that because that's just the pain in the butt. I'm just going to undo. And I just wanted to cover the point that if you change the points or the polygons on an object and you make a material selection, that's going to get messed up. So just keep that in mind. So there you go. So using the bevel deformer, using the polygon selections that we had created through the correction deformer, super, super important stuff. We can extrude stuff. We can do other kind of things with isolated polygons or edge selections and stuff like that. One thing we can do is maybe make like a rounded cube, like a different type of rounded cube, by going and grabbing our correction deformer, making a child of the cube, going to the edge mode and doing like an edge loop selection. So I'll just selecting all of the edges of my cube here. And I just want to say bevel those edges so we have a nice rounded rectangle kind of thing. So we're just going to go ahead and say set selection, and then let's grab a new bevel deformer. And again, we want to place this after the correction deformer, and I'll need to make sure that this is actually edge selection is applied to the object I want. And now I can go and say choose this edge selection, and now I can offset and add subdivisions here, and I have a nice smooth rounded rectangle here, which is really cool because typically you'd only be able to make this by creating a rectangle, rounding it, and then extruding it. But we have another way to do that now using the correction and the bevel deformer. So just something you can keep in mind there. And again, we have full options of adjusting this as well. But again, since we're introducing points or we're introducing polygons and edges, that's going to mess up the edge selection that we made when we had that previous number of edges and stuff like that. So just a little gotcha, just want to pay attention to. So that is using selections and stuff like that with the correction deformer, but we can go a little bit further with that. And the polygon or the correction deformer can do a lot more than that as well. So the key thing to remember here is that we have access to points, edges, and polygons on our object. So here I have a jiggle deformer and a shear deformer making this bouncy little rectangle here and adding this really nice, squash and stretch animation. Say I want to, cache this animation or bake all the deformer animation. Well, we can do that by going and grabbing a correction deformer. And again, order of operation is very important. We want this to bake everything before it. So we want the jiggle and the shear to happen and then the correction deformer. And again, since we have access, since the correction deformer allows us to have access to all the points and stuff, we can use something called the point cache. And what this allows us to do is cache PSR animation. So point, position, scale, and rotation, or just point position. And this will be able to store that. So I'll just say store state like that. And then I'll just say calculate. And I can now turn off the jiggle deformer and the shear deformer. And you're going to see that that point cache stored all of the point movement and information that was created by all the deformers before it and stored it in this point cache tag. So what this allows us to do is use all the options in our point cache, namely like the scale. So the scale basically slows down the deformation of, or the animation applied from our deformers. So you can see that just slowed down our jiggle deformer animation by half. So I just made it 50%. So this allows us to, art direct something like the jiggle deformer a little bit more. So we have the scale, which is like the time scale, and we also have the offset. So maybe we want the scale, jiggle deformer animation to, start 5 frames earlier, or maybe we want it to start 5 frames later. So it's a little bit more offset, right? So a little bit more art directable with our deformers. You can see that maybe that offset actually helps a little bit there. Maybe it adds a little bit more interesting looks. So using the point cache with to be able to bake deformers. Now again, typically you'd need to make this cube editable and then go and drag that into your timeline and then go to function bake objects. And again, that involves making your cube or your parametric object editable. With the correction deformer, again, we can keep that live and parametric, so very important. So one last thing I'm going to show, and that is that not only can you use the point cache to bake deformer animation, but we can also do cloner animation or dynamics. So here I have my little objects here, and they're falling. Very, very intense animation here. I put a lot of thought into it. But what we can do to bake all this is by doing just a couple steps. So a cloner object is going to need to be combined together so that when we have our correction deformer, it actually recognizes all of the clones underneath our cloner object. And to do that, we're going to go ahead and grab a connect object. And with our connect object selected, we're just going to drag and drop that object or the cloner into our connect object. So kind of like how I told you to, make sure that when you make a sweep object to say create single object. So it just binds everything together, welds everything together, and makes any deformer treat it as if it's one cohesive object, right? So we want this cloner and all the clones to be one cohesive object. So now what we can do is go and grab our correction deformer, and we have access to all the points underneath it. Now let me just show you the wrong way to do this. And again, we would, to have a deformer act upon a cloner, we need to make it group together so we can have this correction deformer under the same level of hierarchy. And I accidentally created an array. So I'll just place this correction deformer in the same level of hierarchy. You're going to notice the only points we have access to is this capsule. And that's because the correction deformer doesn't recognize all the clones in the cloner until we use a connect object and then use the correction deformer. So very important step there. Hopefully that makes sense. So the connect and the correction, we have access to all those points. So now again, we can go and grab our point cache and say store state and then calculate, and that rhymed. And we can then, go back and forth here. And this is all cached. And again, we can adjust the time scale so we can have the dynamics go at 50%. And then we can even keyframe that to do like a to totally art direct the timing of this thing happening right here. And, you know, offsetting, you can't keyframe that, so I would just recommend you keyframe the scale. So Correction Deformer has a ton of uses. I just scratched the surface, but hopefully by covering the Correction Deformer, hopefully you'll be using it in your day-to-day workflow like me. I use it all the time. I'm very anal retentive about keeping all my objects parametric and not making things editable and keeping copies and backup copies of each object, because that's a pain in the butt and I don't like a lot of clutter. So Correction Deformer, super important. Again, just the basic level of the Correction Deformer allowing you to have access to you know, the points, edges, and polygons of objects is a super huge, it's a simple thing, but super huge when it comes to, you know, improving your workflow. And, you know, if you have any more creative uses for this, I'm sure you'll find them just experimenting a little bit more with all the things you can do with the Correction Deformer. So I really encourage you to go out there and experiment with the pickle with the motion tracker balls on it, aka the Correction Deformer. All right, so there is your nice little overview of all the things that the Correction Deformer can do. And I've just kind of scratched the surface of what it can do. I'm sure you can figure out a lot of things if you experiment and play around with the Correction Deformer, which I really encourage you doing. If you have any questions about the Correction Deformer or anything I covered in this tutorial, leave them in the comments section. I'll get to them as soon as I can. And if you like this tutorial, please hit the like button, or if you like this channel, subscribe. I'd really appreciate that. And as always, I really appreciate all of you out there watching. If you want to see more of these workflow related tutorials, definitely let me know. I'd love to see what you guys think about this tutorial. And until then, I'll see you guys in the next tutorial, all right? Bye, everybody.